Okay, should be all right. Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for your patience. Sorry for the technical difficulties. My name is Michael. I am from California. I was born and raised there. Don't hold it against me. It's just where I'm from. I currently live in Carlsbad, California, just north of San Diego. If any of you know where that is, it's kind of sandwiched in between Orange County and San Diego, so way down south. With my wife and 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls, 11, 9, 6, and 3. And we are so glad that the 3-year-old is out of the 2s. She's very strongly opinionated, let's just say. So anyway, super happy to be here. I actually run a company called React Training. And I'm in town for a couple of days doing a couple of React workshops over at Indeed, the Indeed headquarters. Part of this is kind of what I do full time is I go around and I train companies on how to use React. I've been doing it now for about 3 years. I've trained everywhere from really big tech companies to really tiny startups and everything in between. I've trained companies in lots and lots of different industries: medicine, real estate, high tech, media. Whatever you're doing, it seems like everybody's using React these days. And so that's my company, and we publish quite a bit of open source software. So the most well-known piece of software that we write is React Router. And that was kind of how this company started, actually, is in 2014. So this project is very soon going to be 4 years old. We started writing React Router. I was, at the time, working on my own startup. I was working on a chat application. I had been through Y Combinator, and so we had some funding, and we had a lot of kind of expectations, I guess, out of this company. And I was using Ember.js at the time. And I'm not going to say it was because of Ember. It was probably, a bit of it and my lack of experience with it. I just wasn't able to get it done. Wasn't able to get the job done. And it was a pretty kind of, it was a very it was kind of one of those experiences where you kind of look inside and you kind of think okay, what am I doing with my life? maybe I'm not a developer. Maybe I should have been in sales. Those sales guys, they drive pretty nice cars and they're always wearing nice jackets and things. Maybe I could have been one of them. And so I was kind of looking around. I was kind of evaluating, some of the decisions that I'd made, and just kind of experimenting with things. And it was at that time that I found React. React at that time, we're speaking 2014, was not very popular, actually. Surprisingly enough, because it's incredibly popular today. We kind of see that from time to time, I feel like. You don't realize what you have, and then all of a sudden something happens and something becomes very popular. So this was before React's inflection point. In fact, React's debut was in 2013 at JSConf.eu, and the by far the majority opinion was kind of this is ridiculous, right? This is weird. Having this kind of markup in my JavaScript is just weird, and a lot of people kind of dismissed it as a fad. Well, I was just kind of pretty much as desperate as you could get. I was as low as you could go, and I was like, well, me and React, we're just going to go over here in the corner and be rejects together. And so I was checking out React, and I started playing with it, and I was like, this is actually kind of fun. This is actually really fun. And coming from the place where I was, building that app that I had been building, and I started building pieces of it in React, and I saw how it solved problems and addressed problems that I had been trying to solve myself for the last year in this other framework, and I saw how a lot of those problems, a lot of the kind of big sort of insurmountable problems that I was facing just kind of didn't even exist in React because of some of the decisions that React had made, because of some things around the way that React has the virtual DOM and things about how React you don't actually have to go and manage the DOM yourself. Anyway, a lot of those things kind of turned me on to React, and so I was like, great, let's try and use this thing. At that time, a router did not exist yet for React, so I went and wrote one with my business partner Ryan Florence, and that's when people started asking us to come and do some trainings for their companies and teach them how to do React. So that kind of segued into what I do now, which is teach React full time. So last word about me is we've got I'll be doing our advanced React workshop tomorrow and the next day at Indeed HQ right here in Austin. And then I'll be in New York next week, and then Chicago, and I kind of travel all over. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about tonight is the new React Context API. You might have kind of heard about this. How many people have heard about, oh, there's a new React Context API that's coming, right? From those people who've heard about it, how many are like already using the existing Context API? Okay, so 2 or 3 people, okay? So what I want to do is just kind of talk about, the existing API context, what it is for, why it's useful, and then I want to show, what the old API was, what you used to do, what were the problems with the old API, why do we need a new one, and then show you what the new API is, and even show you how you can start using it today. So this should be, so we're going to cover kind of the whole gamut of this problem, right? So, the way that I actually kind of discovered context, I certainly didn't invent it, but so I was working on the router, and let me tell you something about React Router. So if you've never used it before, the structure is kind of like this. You have a router at the root of your app, and this is a router component, and then you build your app. And you could have some divs here. And of course you could have, just as many divs as you want. And then, somewhere down the line, you've got, you may have a link to some path. Domino's Pizza. Okay. So this is kind of like some pseudocode that kind of describes what a React Router application might look like. Okay, so we've got components. This router component. We've got this link component. We've got a couple of other components. If you've ever used the router, we've got a route component and a couple of others, a redirect and a switch. But this is kind of the API. And if you've had any experience with single page routing, the whole point of single page routing is to not go to the server and do a full page refresh, right? You want to be able to do all of your routing on the client side, okay? And so what what a single page router typically does is, for example, when you click on a link, instead of sending a request to the server to reload the whole page, what you're going to do is you're going to intercept that request for that, for that URL, and you're going to go and navigate or change the screens right there. Maybe you need to go load some data, but you can go and do that. Maybe show a spinner while you're loading some data, whatever. It comes back, you render the page, right? So the whole point is intercepting the clicks on these links and then modifying the location of the current URL in the address bar and in the router, okay? All of that just to say that these two components have to communicate, okay? They have to communicate. And the typical way of communicating between components in React is component passes props to its children, they pass props to their children, they pass props down, right? And you kind of get this sort of cascade of props. But we didn't have that luxury on the router because you could put these links anywhere. You could put these links anywhere in your page, anywhere you wanted to. And so one day I was actually was kind of like spelunking in the React source code, and I was like, I'm gonna, like, I've got this problem, and I'm gonna hack React. I was in this mindset. Actually, let me just full screen that. So here we are. Wait, so what version am I on? Yeah, I think I'm on the, let's just see. No. Let's see, composite component.js. Jeez. The source code moves around a lot, so it's hard to find things sometimes. Okay, so this is the source. We are deep in the source of React here. So I was in this file a couple of years ago. And remember, my goal going here was, I'm going to figure out how to hack React. And I didn't know how I was going to hack it. All I knew was that this was a problem for us in React Router. And I thought, look, not everybody's going to have to hack it, but we're like a big library and a lot of people depend on this. And like, maybe it's okay if just we hack it and then nobody else will have to, right? Like, we are exempt, right? Yeah. Everybody thinks they're the exception, right? So that was me. So I came in here and I'm looking around and I'm thinking, how can I hack this thing? And so I started, reading through the code essentially to just try and figure out, how does the code work? And it was funny because everywhere I saw the word props, like almost on the very next line, I saw the word context. And I was like, I know what props are. Props was a very well-documented feature, it still is, of React. We all know about passing props, right? But there was nothing at that time in the docs about context. And nobody that I asked on the Slack channel, or there's not Slack, the IRC channel or the mailing list, nobody knew anything about this context. And it's funny because, if you go and you start searching through this source code, it's literally like props and context. Here's, props and context. Props and context. And so I was looking at it and I was like, okay, so basically everywhere that props is coming on, everywhere that props is going, context is going too. I'm trying to unravel somebody else's code, right? And there was a certain part where I saw this, and I was like, this dot props, I know what it is. This dot state, I know what it is. This dot context, I do not know what that is. That sounds like it's secret. That sounds like that's my hook. That's the way I'm going to hack it, right? And so I was actually at ReactConf 2015, and I saw one of the core React developers. We were kind of at like an after party, and he kind of had a drink, and I was just kind of standing there, and I looked across the room, and we kind of like made eye contact, and then he turned and started walking quickly the other way. So I was like, I'm gonna catch this guy. So I basically am doing like, the quick walk, right? Trying to catch him. He's like looking over his shoulder. He's starting to like walk faster. I like cornered him around the other side of the pool outside, and I was like, hey, Sebastian. Hey, I'm Michael. I work on React Router. It's like, yeah, I know. I was like, hey, nice to meet you. So anyway, I was wondering, I was digging through the React source code the other day, and I saw this thing called context. And no matter who I ask, nobody knows. And I figure if anybody knows, it's going to be you, because you're the one who probably wrote it. So could you help me understand what this context thing is? And he's standing there with his drink, and he kind of like looks around, make sure that like nobody's listening, and he's like, well, it's kind of this thing that we don't really like tell people about it. It's kind of like this secret API. But, and I'm like, well, why is it in there? Well, we thought it might be useful for routing. I was like, I don't know if you missed my intro. I work on React Router. That would be really cool if you could share this info with me. You know, like tell me about, like, that would be cool because I'm having some problems with the router right now. And if you built a feature for the routing, that would be great. And so he's like, well, okay, so let me tell you what it is. And he said, essentially, it's a way to pass props down without passing props down, right? So it's a way to get data down the tree, down the component tree, without having to pass props down at every single level, okay? So let me kind of try and make some sense of this. What does this even mean? So here I've got a pretty basic, just a basic app. It just prints out the current time, right? So if we wanted to make this clock tick, we could keep the time in state, right? So I could say here, the current date is, date is a new date. And then I'll just say this.state.date. And then when the component mounts, what I'll do is maybe I'll set an interval so that every second, what I'll do is I'll say this.setState. The date is going to be a new date every second. Okay, so we just have a little clock here that's kind of ticking along. Every second, we've set up an interval to set the state so we see the tick. Okay. So I'm not walking. Okay. So this is all fine and good when the state lives in a single component, right? But what if this state lives in a child component, right? Let's say for some reason we want the state to live up here in the clock, but then we want to have, you know, like a separate kind of like a display component for it. Extends react.component. Okay. So I'm going to render a clock. And then inside here, I'm going to render a display. Okay. So let's see. So this thing, I'm just going to copy the rendering logic and put it down here. Okay. So the question becomes now, what does a clock render? Like, what does a clock render if it's not rendering the display, right? Well, maybe it just renders, you know, this.props.children. And this doesn't have any state anymore, so we'll just say new date. Okay, so if we go and inspect this app right now, we will see, unsurprisingly, that's not the one I wanted to zoom in, that is, unsurprisingly, we will see the state of this clock is still ticking, even though the display is not, right? So somehow we have to get the data out of that clock down into our display. And it's like I said, we don't want this display to actually live inside the render method. We want it to live down here. So for whatever reason, so the way that we can sort of pass this prop implicitly, kind of behind the scenes, is using context. So this is kind of interesting, right? So we can say static child context types. We'll say there's a clock on context, and it has a date object, which is a prop types.object.is required. Okay, so this is a prop types dot shape that is required. Okay, so there's this bit of API called the child context types. So in the parent, if we say child context types, now we're putting something on context. And if we have a method called get child context, this is where we return that object. So we could return the clock, and the date will be this dot state dot date. Okay, so all we've done so far is we put something on context. We put something called the clock on context that has a date object that is this dot state dot date. Okay, now in order to get that out in the child, we need to use an API called static context types. And my context types are actually just going to be this. Looks similar to prop types, right? In fact, you use prop types to declare your context types, right? So, so static context types. And now the display is going to have access to an object called this.context. An object of this shape, in fact, right? So remember I told you I was looking around in the code there, and I saw this object this.context, and I was like, what is the object this.context? So this is what it is. If you have a parent that sets up some context like this, it can sort of implicitly pass data without having to explicitly pass a prop, right? There's no prop passing here. This display gets the clock context just by virtue of the fact that it's rendered as a child or a descendant of the clock. Okay, and this is cool because, you know, if we've got other UI in here, and this can go as deep as we want, right? Multiple levels deep, doesn't matter. Clock still works, right? Which is really, really cool, particularly if your name is Michael Jackson and it's 2015 and you're working on a React router that has links and routers that need to communicate across an unspecified, you know, number of different elements in the tree. You look at this and you're like, oh my gosh, this is what I've been looking for. Why aren't we telling the world about this? Why is this so secret? Well, there's some problems with it. Let's see, React context.
Is the get children, is that a convention?
The get child context, this thing?
Is that a convention that gets
called? That's a framework method, yep.
Okay.
Yep, so the parent API is child context types and get child context. So basically here you declare, these are the types of things that I'm going to put on context, and here's how you get it, okay? You know, another way that you can think about context is kind of like this. Let's say you had a function, and you know, you had a variable in here, and then you had another function, and you wanted to, you know, log that message, right? Inside this function, even though the variable is not declared in this function, because this function was defined in this scope, you have access to that variable, right? That's kind of how I think about context sometimes, is in terms of JavaScript scope, because it's something that we already understand JavaScript scope, okay? Okay, so if you go and read the React docs, these are the current React docs on context. They will say, by the way, these docs were not in there when I needed them. With React, it's easy to track the flow of data through your React components. I would agree. When you look at a component, you can see which props are being passed, which makes your apps easy to reason about. Reason about. That's a phrase from Rich Hickey. I think it's kind of overused. Anyway, in some cases, you want to pass data through the component tree without having to pass the props down manually at every level. Yes! So tired of passing those props down every level. You can do this directly in React with the powerful context API. Oh, I'm saved. This is excellent, right? Why not to use context? I thought you just said it was going to solve all my problems. It's powerful. You can do this like directly in React. This is great. Why? Okay, all right, well, I'll read this. The vast majority of applications do not need to use context. Okay, yeah, fine. I'm not the vast majority of applications. We've already said that I am the exception. If you want your application to be stable, don't use context. Why? Okay, let's assume for a second that I just don't care about application stability at all. And I'm willing to risk it. I'll go with it. It is an experimental API and is likely to break in future releases of React. Ooh. If you aren't familiar with state management libraries like Redux or MobX, don't use context. All right. Second time they've told me not to use context. For many practical apps, these libraries and the React bindings, yada, 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 yada. If you're still learning React, don't use context. Well, I'm a pro, so I can ignore that one. There's usually a better way to implement functionality just using props and state. Here's my favorite part. If you insist on using context, despite these warnings, try to isolate your use of context to a small area and avoid using the context API directly when possible so it's easier to upgrade when the API changes. My goodness, what are they so worried about? Right? What was Sebastian so worried about when he was like looking around and saying like, well, it's something we don't really tell people about, right? Well, besides the fact that it's an implicit API, which I think just makes people generally uncomfortable, right? I mean, it's not at all obvious that there's some data passing going on here when I look at this app, right? There's just a clock, a couple of divs, there's a display. Somehow this display, even though it has no state, is magically sort of getting this data that is changing over time. Like, where is that even coming from, right? It's not very easy to sort of track the flow of things when things are implicit. Anybody ever use Ruby on Rails? You know what I mean. All right. When things are implicit, it's hard to track. When things are explicit, it's easy to track, right? So there's that kind of like major kind of like caveat that if you've been using React, you kind of look at that with a side eye. But the major reason, and I think the main reason why context, why we have all these warnings around it, is because it's currently kind of broken in React. So React has this other piece of the API called should component update. Should component update, I wish we had more time to dig into it, but it is basically an optimization, a way for you to indicate to the reconciler, to React's reconciler, that, hey, I don't need to be updated. Me and my children, all my children, don't need to be updated, okay? So it's a way for you to kind of optimize your app. So let's say that instead of a div here, let's have an update blocker. Oops. What is an update blocker, Michael? Well, an update blocker is, it's basically anything that returns false from should component update. So I'm just going to return this.props.children here. And then I'm going to have a should component update, this is another React lifecycle method. And it's incredibly useful, by the way, right? So you want to use this like when you have a performance problem. This is a great tool to use. But let's just say, for example, that in this case, every single time it returns false. Okay, just for so we can see what's going on here. Okay, so basically every single time that we render this app, the reconciler is going to go through only so far as update blocker, and then it's going to say, update blocker, should I update you? And update blocker is going to say, nope. And remember, that's, I don't need to be updated and my children don't need to be updated. So I don't need to be updated, but also the display doesn't need to be updated either. Nobody needs to be updated. We're good. It's extremely useful sometimes, but not when you're using the context API. Now all we get is sadness. Because our clock is busted. Why is our clock busted? Well, update blocker, right? And so you might think like, well, that's just dumb, Michael. You're not going to throw an update blocker into your app just for no reason, right? Totally. So what if instead of update blocker, you're extending React.PureComponent? How does PureComponent work? Right? PureComponent is essentially an update blocker when its props don't change, right? And so, I've seen some people will say, oh, use PureComponent everywhere. Every component should be a pure component, every component. Well, now you're going to have this problem with context if you're using it. And by the way, when they say don't use context, Redux is using context, React Router is using context. If you're using either of those libraries, you are using context. So it's kind of it's like, whatever, you're using it. And when you're doing this kind of thing in your app, using PureComponent everywhere, you get like this kind of weird behavior because now the URL changed, but my UI didn't update. Why? Oh, I have an update blocker in the tree and I didn't even realize it, right? So you could be inserting an update blocker anywhere in the tree, not even realizing it. Also, if you were using Redux, for example, and all of your connected components are update blockers. If their props don't change, given the state of their Redux store, if their props don't change, they won't update. They only look at their props, right? So this is a problem, obviously, with this API, right? So we can no longer pass data down through the tree for people who are using these kinds of optimizations in their apps. But it's a useful optimization. We don't want to tell people, no, sorry, you can't use that anymore because it breaks context. It's really useful. So there's this kind of mishmash, right? It's a total edge case. But now you know why they're like, oh my gosh, don't use it unless you have to. And then if you have to, you better know what you're doing. Otherwise, don't use it at all. If you're still learning React, don't use it. Normally people just ignore these warnings anyway. I don't know. This used to have a big red background. I thought it was a lot more like influential then and like scary. Anyway, nowadays if you go to the context docs, you will see a new safe version of context is under development for the upcoming 16.3 release. Woohoo! Safe version of context. What is that all about? Let's click through. Let's see. So the new version of context looks something like this. You basically have a provider.
Could you zoom in a bit?
Yeah. I need to update this example. It's not even that good of an example because he doesn't have an update blocker in the tree. But basically, you have a provider component. You give it a value, and then in the child, you can pull out that value with a render prop. When I say the term render prop, how many people know what that means?
I don't know what provider means though.
Yeah, okay, we'll go into that. So if you don't know what render prop means, I gave a talk last year at Phoenix, I think, React. Go watch that one and then come back and watch this one.
With the mouse?
Yeah, with the mouse.
The cat and the mouse?
With the mouse. The cat and the mouse. Yeah, that was me. So that's this right here, right? The consumer has a render prop. So what the provider is doing is the provider is essentially taking this value, putting it on context, and then the consumer is just getting the value out off of context and rendering with it. Okay? So this is, it's kind of interesting. So I want to show you how we can actually use this app. So I'm actually going to leave the update blocker right in the tree. This example actually does not have an update blocker in the tree. So I don't think it is as interesting as an example that does have an update blocker in the tree. This is like he's asking you to like jump through this hoop. I'm like lighting the hoop on fire and like putting a pool of sharks on the other side, and then I'm like, jump through the hoop. Like that. This doesn't really illustrate that it's solving the problem. So what we're doing here. So the new API looks something like this. You go, let's say I've got my clock context, React. They're leaving it like the best part. React create context. I'll have a new date object. Okay. And now I'm going to say my date is going to be the clock context. And remember, this API is still being fleshed out. So, so I don't think that this is. I want to make that default value property public. I don't want it to be prefixed with an underscore, but we still have to talk about that. But anyway, so the context. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to initialize my state with my context's value. Okay. And then instead of using context manually, I'm just going to comment all this stuff out. I am actually going to render here my clock context dot provider. And its value, I'm going to say, is the this dot state dot date. Better pass on all of our props, because we might have a children prop that it needs to render. So again, instead of using this API with the statics and with the getChild context, all we have to do now is render a provider. Okay, render a provider component. And as your state changes, you pass it a prop in its value prop. Right? So we're back to passing props. Down here in the display, all you have to do is render a clock context.consumer. And in your children prop, you can get out the date and render with it. Oh, geez. Forgot to comment this stuff out. So you don't need your context types, and you don't need, you're just basically not using context anymore at all. Okay? So remember, I've still got the update blocker in the tree. Update blocker hasn't gone anywhere. We've still got the update blocker in the tree, and yet using this mechanism, this provider-consumer type mechanism, we can circumvent it. We can go around it. Okay. This was actually like this is huge, right? This essentially means that, you know, anytime that you're like passing a bazillion props down, like you could just use a provider and a consumer. It's kind of like it's almost like you're like throwing a message over this wall, right? That was put in between there. You don't know how thick the wall is or how deep it is, whatever. You don't care. You're just going to toss this message over. You're the provider, and there's the consumer on the other side. Excuse me. That's going to catch it. Where did my water go? Any questions thus far?
So I noticed you didn't invoke the date constructor when you passed it into create context, and I was just curious why, or if that was intentional.
I did. I said new date. Yeah. Oh, are you saying I left off the parens here?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's, you don't have to
Gotcha.
in JavaScript, but since I'm using Prettier, it adds them back in for me. Yeah.
What happens if you put the update blocker in between line 50 and 51?
What happens if I put the update blocker in line 50 and 51? Oh, here?
Yeah.
This is going to be fine. Well, actually, hold on. Before I save it, I want to think about it for a second. What is going to happen? I don't know. Oh. Well, now we know. It doesn't matter. I think what's probably going on here, right, is, so what's cool about these render props one thing that's really cool about the render props is they're explicit, right? So we get the data right here, right in this argument, right here to this function. So we don't have to rely on React propagating that thing through context or anything. We've got it. And so what we're doing essentially is that the clock context, the consumer here is, or the display really, is just rendering a consumer. So it's getting the date here. And then now, I guess it's rendering an update blocker with a different timestamp in it every single time. But it's not relying on the update blocker for propagating updates. It's not relying on context for propagating updates. It's relying on just data that it's got here locally in the function.
It seems like the update blocker is children change, so it's not being blocked. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But it goes through the life cycle of the pure component, right? And pure components only look at props and state. Or do they look at context?
No, they don't. They don't. That's what we demonstrated earlier, right? So with that, so right now, update blocker is a pure component, right? So it's just looking at its props and it's saying no. But I think you're right. Is update blocker is just rendering its children, and technically something in its children did change, so then it renders.
I wonder if it's not because the clock context is rendering every second, so it renders a new update blocker every second.
Well, but that's part of the beauty of React is if you render a component that is the same type it'll just preserve that same component.
Even in the middle.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. If it's at the same position in the tree, it'll just re-render that exact same thing. So yeah, so I tend to think the guy in the back is right. That it's just that the children have a different text. And so the update blocker is still just like, I don't know, I just render my children. And my children are different this time. Right? I mean, really, look, it's pretty simple. It just says, update blocker, what do you render? It's like, my children. My children changed, apparently.
That makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
How does this change how you might want to, like, pass data between, like, sibling components?
It doesn't really help a ton in that case, I don't think. So the question is, how does this change how you might want to pass data between siblings? In that case, I think you're still going to, give each of the siblings basically a callback. They would set state in the parent, and then the parent would pass the new state down as props, I think, to both of those siblings. It really helps in the case, though, where you've got, like these components that you're building, and you've got a disparate, like you don't know how much stuff is going to be in between the parent and the child, like a router and a link, or, depending on how you structure your own components, you may have, some special form and submit button, and you can put a bunch of other UI around it to style it and position it and layout, do stuff like that.
So my use case is I have a nav bar and I have a post button in the nav bar.
Yeah.
But then I have the form.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want the nav bar to be generalized.
Yeah.
And to just render the post button whenever it's on this particular page.
Yeah.
But then.
Can we talk about your app after? Yeah.
No,
yeah, but I'd be happy to talk about that. Yeah. Any other questions about kind of the technique? Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, so how would you test this for a unit test?
Okay, so the question is, how would you test it? So specifically, what would you like to test in this example?
Well, I'd like to test both pieces, right? Let's say that sometimes blocker does block and sometimes it doesn't. Maybe that's conditional. How would I go about testing that?
Sometimes the blocker blocks and sometimes it doesn't.
Correct, based on a condition, based on data that comes into the blocker. So the blocker is you can switch logic, so it's a sometimes blocker.
Okay.
And based on data that comes in, it's
so here it's got a prop that sometimes changes and sometimes doesn't.
that's correct.
For example. I don't think it changes much the story there, right? Because maybe this comes from this dot props dot something. And if you want to test the app, you just render the app, and then maybe you go clicking around, and this dot props dot something doesn't change, and so you could just assert that its children didn't change. I don't know. I don't think it changes the story a whole lot. The context changes don't. The render prop does kind of change the story around testing, because when you're, and I need to follow up my stuff with render props with some more stuff about testing, but the idea is when you're using a render prop, there's like some state in the component that it needs to expose in the render prop so you can render with it. And that is sometimes tricky to test because you have to accumulate the state in that component so that you can get it out in the prop. But I don't think the context API changes the testing story very much. It's still just you're passing in props, you're rendering, you're asserting on the output based on what it renders.
Could you go to the create context function?
Yeah, the create context. Yeah.
Yep,
we were all the way up here. Yep.
So you're passing in a new date. Is that first argument, is that the initial state of context?
Yeah. So I tend to think of it about, so that's a good question. So what is this argument here to create context? Is that the initial state? I think about it more as sort of the default value,
Okay.
right? So the reason it's there is, let's say, for example, let's say that, this display, we forgot to render it inside a clock. It's 8:49. It's late. We forgot to render it inside a clock, right? So it's, when it says, hey, I'm a consumer, like, what are you consuming at that point, right? Nothing, right? You've got nothing to consume. There is no provider that's providing you new values. And in fact, we can see that it's frozen right here. So what it has is it has a default value that it can still use to render with, even though and this is useful, this is actually really useful in a testing scenario, right? Because if you didn't want to, render this whole app, just so you could test the display, maybe you wanted to test the display in isolation, you can just assert that, oh, it's showing the date that was the default date that I passed into the context constructor, right? So I think of it more like a default value than a,
Okay.
yeah, or like an initial value. Like
And
an
what
initial
other
state.
kinds of, is it just default value and then provider and consumer? Is that the full API of?
Yeah, that is the full API at this point. As I said, it's still kind of in flux. It's still experimental. There are still a couple of changes, I think, that I would like to propose that they make to it. There's one thing here, which is like, it's like, yeah, it is actually. Here, let's pop this thing open. So the clock context, these things, these bits, calculate changed bits. So there's like this bit mask thing, and they've got this idea where like you pass in a bit mask and like some of the context changed, but not the whole thing. And then you've got a consumer that's just listening for like the piece that changed and not the whole thing. So it's basically just a way, unless I'm misunderstanding it, and it's totally possible that I could be missing something, it seems like it's a way to avoid creating multiple contexts,
Okay.
right? So like you could potentially here say something like, the date is that, and then, the counter is something else, right? So you could have like multiple values in here and then like pass in a bit mask to say like, which ones of those values do I care about? Which ones don't I? I think that's what it's for, but again, don't quote me on that. I'm not sure. But yeah, the short answer to your question is yes, this is the API.
Okay,
So you create a context, you give it a default value, then you've got provider and consumer, and you just pass the value prop to the provider, and out it comes in the render prop of the consumer, which is really, really nice. Yeah.
Do you think they're intending to like build on what you and I guess Dan have created with Redux and integrate that into the core, or are they like keeping it lean?
Yeah. So I want to clarify. I didn't actually build Redux. I built the router.
Yeah. Well, I meant Dan Abramov, right?
Yeah. Dan built Redux with Andrew Clark. I think was his co-conspirator on that thing. But so both Redux and the router use context as a way to communicate between components. But these changes in context don't make either of those libraries like totally obsolete. Like if that's all you were using Redux for, is just just passing props, you know? Like you don't care about the middleware, you don't care about the reducers, you don't care about the actions, you don't care about any of the other stuff that Redux gives you. All you wanted to do was like a better way to pass props. Then yeah, you could totally use this context API, and you wouldn't have to use Redux anymore. But Redux is a lot more valuable than just a method for distributing props. Like you've got the, yeah, like I said, you've got the middleware and the reducers and the actions. You've got like a structured way of thinking about how the state changes things, one at a time. So it's not going to obsolete any of that stuff, but it is definitely going to help, I think, with interop, because the router and Redux were kind of fighting for a while on because Redux wanted pure components, and in the router we were like, well, why are all these components pure? Like, why can't you just let our context updates go through? And so we had to figure this out. And it was actually, I had done a bit of work. So this context API is actually based on work that I had done in a library called React Broadcast. Has anybody ever heard of this one? React Broadcast? No. So React Broadcast is so this is our old API. So we had a broadcast and a subscriber, and basically this was the API. Like, you'd have a broadcast and you would give it a value, and then you could get that value out in your subscriber. And this is an old library, and you would put your update blocker in there, and it doesn't matter, the value would still come through in your subscriber. This is kind of how I just wanted to wrap up. Is if you are interested in using this new API, but you are not yet using React 16.3-beta 2, which you should not be using, by the way. Here we go, React.version. Oh, come on. Oh, I've got to expose it on the global. Just want to double check the version of React that I'm using. Yeah, so this is, okay, oh, alpha, wow. So I'm using 16.3 alpha 2. So this is like the very alpha quality stuff. If you don't want to use the alpha to get this new API, you could actually use it today. You could, let's see. Why is that? Okay, yarn add React broadcast. Not this one. At next. So I actually built this new API that they're proposing in current React. So let's see. So the way that you could do this is, I promise I will finish. Import, create context from React broadcast. And then you can basically just say that, and mine is a public property. And I think that's all you need. Nope. What did I do wrong? Oh, I also give you a warning if you render the consumer outside of the context of its provider. So if you have no provider, I warn you about it. The official API doesn't yet. I think it probably should. Again, something that needs to be discussed, but it's nice that I warned myself about it, because otherwise I would have been standing up here in front of a bunch of people looking like an idiot, not sure why my app didn't work. And I could still look like an idiot if it doesn't work now, but it does. Thankfully, it does. So if you wanted to use it today, you could just use React Broadcast, install React Broadcast at next, and you can get tomorrow's API today. Yeah. Yeah.
So will we see HOC helpers like with router go away?
That's a good question. Not for a long time. I mean, HOC is still a very popular pattern. Lots of people still use it. I'm certainly not using it, but I can see why people want to use it and why it's useful for their apps. But yeah, it definitely in the next version of React Router, we're going to be basing it all on this work that's in React 16.3. So it's not going to be that useful anymore. It'll really only be useful in like apps that are built on Router 4 right now, which has been out now for I think more than a year. Yeah, we did it like last February, I think.
That'd be nice, because like you mentioned earlier, the
Yeah.
implicit stuff is annoying, it's hard to track down.
Yeah.
And HOCs, especially when you get strings of them,
Mm-hmm.
really hard to figure out
Yeah.
which one's breaking.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And you just use a render prop and it's like so much clearer, right? Yeah.
So I have a little trouble visualizing how it solved your router problem. Do you have like either sample code or just some pseudocode that you can show me how this like helped you with your router link?
Yeah. This is the last thing I'll do. I'll try and finish up by 9 o'clock because I think that's probably as late as we want to go. All right. So let's see. So if I'm a router, that's a great question, by the way. I'm being way too hand wavy tonight. I need to get down to some real code here. So if I'm a router, let's say I've got the route provider, right? So the route context. So I could say my routing context is the create the context, and that is like window.location, essentially, right? So the current location of the app, essentially, right? The current URL. And then I'm going to return a routing context.provider, and then the value of this routing context is just going to be the so the state here would be we'll say the current location is going to be the routing context.default value, and then the value here would just be this state.location, right? And of course, we'd pass in all of our other porps or props. Okay, so you can imagine that this thing is your router. This thing's living up top, and then you've got all these other components that are down below. Oh, look at that! It just crossed 9 o'clock. These other components that are down below that need to know, for example, what is the route? What is the current URL? Right. So a route is the way that you render a route is, if you're not familiar with the API, is it's got a path. And so you say when the URL is like users slash ID, then render something, right? That's the router API. Okay, render a component or whatever you want. And so, in order for route to even understand, to even know that the URL changed, it's gonna have to subscribe, right? So it could sit down here and say, hey, I'm gonna return a routing context .consumer, and I'm going to get in my children prop. I'm going to get the current location, and now I can render whatever I want with that thing. I can say it does this.props.path match the location path name, for example. Does that help kind of visualize what's going on? Right. So if there is an update blocker in between my router and my route, then my routes don't get updates. That's why I called it an update blocker. Cool. All right. Hey, great questions. We had a great discussion. I really don't want to keep anybody who wants to get out of here. I will be sticking around though. I'll probably be drinking a Coke or something and trying to nurse my voice. I'm usually not this hoarse. As I said, we've still got just a couple of seats open for our advanced React workshop tomorrow and Friday. So if you're not doing anything, come on by. We'd love to have you at reacttraining.com. My name is Michael Jackson. You can find me as mjackson on Twitter and NPM and GitHub and pretty much anywhere else. Thank you all very much. Secrets.